In this lesson, I'm going to talk about what I believe are really the keys to human healing, the single most important aspects of emotional recovery, and what I believe are in some ways the most powerful processes that co-counseling has to offer to people who are pursuing emotional healing from ways that they've been injured in the past. So I'm going to begin with a sort of step back from the central points to create a little background. At first, I want to say that you've likely heard, as so many people have, that being under emotional stress is bad for our health. Damages our immune system and other aspects of our physical well-being. Well, that's not entirely true. When you really look at the research, and I spent a fair bit of time looking at research into these questions, you get studies that do find emotional distress harming people physically, and then you find studies that don't. In fact, you find some studies that show, for example, enhanced immune functioning when people are upset or under stress. Their immune system is actually functioning better, being stronger. And well, so how do you reconcile these different findings? Well, I spent some time with it, and I formed my conclusions. And my conclusions are that short-term stress is actually good for us, and that chronic stress is bad for us. And so our bodies really intend for us to be upsettable. Being upset is not a bad thing. And there are reasons why we have our distressing emotions, our uncomfortable or unpleasant or painful emotions. They exist to alert us to potential dangers to us in our environment. So there's a reason why we have fear. Like, fear is there to alert us to danger. And there are reasons why we have grief. Grief is there to alert us to the risk of isolation, of becoming alone, of becoming cut off from close human contact. Because close human contact is so essential to the human being, has been for hundreds of thousands of years. We have anger to alert us to the presence of injustice, because injustice is dangerous to us, and so forth. So painful emotions aren't a bad thing. And this is one place where I differ from certain emotional healing systems or spiritual systems that say that the ultimate goal of human consciousness is to get to a state where nothing would bother us, where we would just be in kind of this even-stated bliss, detached, nothing upsetting us. I don't believe that that's actually the highest state of consciousness. I believe we can get better than that. We can get to a place where we do not have to detach in any way, where we can be deeply connected and passionate and attached to things, and we get upset, and we get over being upset and spend the great majority of our time feeling really good. And I actually think that's how our bodies were designed to function. So, the body question. So, if short-term stress is necessary because it gives us information about our environment, what does that mean? Like, how is our body going to respond? Well, our body's going to respond by increasing its processes. Our heart rate may go up, the other body systems may go onto alert, and our immune system may go onto alert, which is why you get these studies showing enhanced immune functioning when people are upset. Now, what happens if people stay upset for weeks and months and years? Well, our body can't tolerate being constantly on alert. Your heart can't be constantly at an increased rate. Your immune system can't be constantly extra activated. That'll exhaust it. And so I believe that the reason some studies are showing improved immune functioning and other studies are showing damaged immune functioning is because they're actually seeing the effects of the same thing. Because if you're upset, but you stay upset for long time, then your immune system is going to exhaust itself, and you're going to start to have health problems, and you're going to start to have damaged immune functioning rather than enhanced immune functioning. So our body's plan is for us to be upset and then get over being upset once the situation, whatever the situation is in the world, in our lives, in our communities, has been handled. Then we're supposed to go back to baseline, to basically feeling happy again and feeling good and relaxed. So our body has a plan for how to get rid of distress once we no longer need it. And These are what in co-counseling we call the emotional discharge processes, and what I refer to as the bio-emotional releases. And the reason I call them bio-emotional is because these are actually physiological processes that are built into us, but they're built into us designed to go forward when we're experiencing certain specific things emotionally, and to get those emotions to flow through us and out of us and be away from us so that they can't harm us anymore. And so these discharge processes are built into us. And what they are, I'm going to go over the 5 essential elements of this system, and then I'm going to explain to you more about how we know that these are a unified system. So our body plans for us to cry deep and prolonged, long, intense crying, not weepy crying, but like crying our guts out, like little kids do, to heal grief. Crying is not an expression of grief, it is the healing of grief when it gets a chance to work properly. We laugh, deep and prolonged laughter, in order to heal anxiety and other kinds of fear. We tremble and shake and scream in order to relieve intense fears, what I would call terror. We storm, what you think of as a tantrum, in order to relieve anger. And then there's a mysterious fifth in this system that we don't really know what it does, that's yawning. And I'll explain to you how we know that yawning is part of the same system, even though we don't know exactly what it does. By the way, you may have heard, yawning increases the oxygen supply to the brain, and that's why we yawn. Well, that's not really being held up in research. For one thing, you can put people in rooms that just have tons of oxygen in them, and they won't yawn any less. You also can take deep breaths while you're yawning, and you'll notice that makes you yawn more. It doesn't make you yawn less. So there are recent studies indicating that yawning plays some role in relieving stress, which in the co-counseling world we already knew. But we don't know too much about it. I'll say a little more about it later. But the main point is just it's part of the same system. So these are our body's essential mechanisms for keeping us emotionally well. And unfortunately, they're all stifled in modern society. Maybe they've been stifled for thousands and thousands of years. We don't really have a way to know. But we certainly know that in our times, these aren't permitted. And so, ironically, precisely the processes that are most important to human well-being, particularly for the human that's been traumatized, which is all of us in the modern world, the things that are most important to us are bizarrely, societally forbidden. And this is why emotional healing has become so difficult for the human being. Now, how do we know that these are a unified system? Because they have 7 central characteristics that they've all got in common. All 5 of these systems that I just described. And you won't be able to find any other process that's got all of these characteristics. In fact, you'll have a hard time finding any other process that's got 2 or 3 of them, never mind all 7 of them. And so I'm going to take you through what those characteristics are and explain a little bit about each of the points. So the first thing is that these are all inborn. No one has to teach you to yawn. No one has to teach you to laugh. A baby who was around people who never laughed would still laugh. A baby who was around people who never cry would still cry, does still cry. We have examples of that certainly in the world. So these are natural processes, and they're biological in nature. In other words, they have physical manifestations. Crying, for example, comes with tears. Like if we obviously cry for a reason. Our body has a whole system about it. And there's limited research, we need more, but there's limited research indicating that tears from crying are chemically different from tears that you have from eye irritations, from like cutting an onion, for example, or other reasons why, or wind, or other reasons why you get teared up. And these discharge mechanisms are spontaneous, so they'll just happen automatically in a little kid, and they're just there. They were built into us and were intended to work. And it's peculiar that somehow there's become this whole suspicion of them, or feeling that they shouldn't be allowed to function, when they just do automatically almost as soon as we're born. They're clearly there for a reason. Second, these systems are designed primarily to function as things are starting to improve. And this is very confusing to people and is an essential point to take in about them. It makes sense from what I was just saying, right? We need our stress to alert us to when there's something to be dealt with, but once we've dealt with it, then we need the stress to go away. So that's why our discharge mechanisms are designed precisely to function as things are starting to improve. So you're not going to tremble while something terrifying is happening, generally. You're going to break into the case of the shakes after it's over. You're in the midst of like a multi-car accident. You're not going to be trembling. You're going to be dealing with trying to control the car, or if you're in the car, how to keep yourself safe or whatever. Then it's over. You look around. You're alive. Then you're going to get a case of the shakes. The same thing happens with grief. For example, people don't typically cry much when they're extremely downhearted. There's research showing that people who are in depression cry less than other people, not more than other people. It's as things are looking better that people will start to cry much more in their lives, or at least to cry more deeply, to have cries that are that nice feeling kind of, ooh, I needed a good cry kind of cry. We may do a lot of like weepy, misery type crying when things are going badly. We don't tend to get much relief from it because it doesn't go deep enough. That deep crying happens when we're feeling better. Even yawning, interestingly enough, there's research in hospitals finding that people yawn more after they're turning the corner in their healing process. That's sort of the language that the researchers used, whether they're there for a sickness or an injury. It's not in their early time in the hospital that they're yawning a lot. It's as they've sort of passed a certain point and things are, their healing is going well, and they're getting closer to being able to get out of the hospital. That's when you start to see more yawning. This is a fact about our discharge processes that is confusing, and it often leads to difficulties between adults and children because adults really don't get it. So a child, for example, will burst into very hard crying after a bad situation has been resolved, after a lost toy has been found, after someone that they've been separated from is now with them. That's when they'll start to cry really hard. And adults, unfortunately, get disparaging about that and will start to say, oh, geez, like, why are you crying now? You're just being silly. Look, everything's okay now. This doesn't make any sense to cry now when everything's okay again. It makes total sense to cry now when everything's okay again. That's how our crying processes were designed to function. So third point about these discharge processes is that they function most deeply when we're accompanied by someone that we care about and that cares about us and who's paying attention to us. And in many cases, they're going to function best when someone's actually in physical contact with us. Someone has a hand on us or maybe is even holding us. In some ways, the third point is just an extension of the second point, because the second point where I was saying these things are designed to function as things are improving, well, if we're accompanied and someone's loving us and paying attention to us and maybe even being affectionate with us, holding us, well, that's kind of a key sign to our bodies that things are improving. And one of the reasons why so few people may realize how deeply healing crying can be, to pick one of the discharge processes, is that we've almost never had the experience of getting to cry long and hard while someone is holding us and not interfering with our crying. Unfortunately, we tend to do a lot of our crying alone, even those of us who like crying and need it, know we need it, and it feels good to us. We tend to do a lot of our crying alone because we have almost no opportunity to cry around other people without those people interfering with our crying. They're either telling us, oh, please don't cry, or they're patting us, or they're rubbing us. When you're holding someone who's crying, just hold them. Hold them still. Don't rub them, don't pat them, don't act agitated. That'll all interfere with their crying. Just hold them. You hold them and they'll be able to cry hard. In fact, holding them will often allow them to cry harder than they were crying before you held them, if you don't do this. And when we're crying around other people, also just their discomfort with the fact that we're crying stops us from crying. Our discomfort stops us from crying. There's just all this interference from having people around. But if people could be around and not interfere, we would be able to cry much harder with other people there. And particularly having someone just hold us and not tell us not to cry. If anything, say, yeah, keep crying, cry harder, go. And cry for a long time, cry for half an hour, cry for an hour with someone holding us tightly. That's when you suddenly discover what crying can do. Because then suddenly for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 days after that, you're feeling better than you have felt in so long. And that's when you realize, like, oh, this is how you heal grief. You don't heal grief by writing in your journal. Although, do keep writing in your journal too. And I'll say more about those things in a few minutes. So next, fourth characteristic that these discharge processes have is that they're contagious. You see somebody crying, you feel like crying. You see somebody yawning, you feel like yawning. Somebody even talks to you about yawning, you probably start to feel like yawning. As I was noticing the other day when I was teaching a class. It's not the emotion that's contagious. You see someone who's sad, that doesn't make you feel like crying. You see someone who's crying, you feel like crying. You see someone who's sleepy or something, that doesn't make you start to yawn. But you see somebody yawning, that's when you start to yawn. It's the discharge, it's the release that's contagious. And I believe that's because on some intuitive level, not consciously, but on some deeper level, we're aware that we're in the presence of a human being who's healing. And so we just automatically want to be part of that. And it's moving to watch someone healing, and we also want to join in. So these processes are all contagious. You're around someone who's letting this stuff out, and if you feel safe, you're going to start to want to be part of it also. Next, these processes all are kind of oddly pleasurable, and this part is a little hard to describe, and I tend to compare it to people with a deep massage. You know how when you have a really deep massage, you hear people use the expression, "Ooh, that hurts so good." You know that expression, "That hurts so good," because it's really uncomfortable and maybe even painful, and yet it kind of feels good at the same time, and you want it to keep happening. This is what happens when deep emotional discharge is happening for people. Someone who's having a really intense cry, for example, may feel it's very, very painful. They're feeling like, oh, this is the saddest I've ever felt in my life. And yet, they don't want it to stop. When you're having a really hard, deep cry, you do not want it to stop. When you're doing sort of weepy crying, what I call misery crying, often you do wish that would stop. But no one who's in a deep, sobbing kind of cry wants it to stop. They want it to go on as long as it can. Because it's this odd mixture of pleasure and pain. The reason it's pleasurable is because we can tell we need to do it. And we can tell that pain that's been fighting usually for years to get out of us is finally getting out, and that we're going to be better as a result. So all of these 5 processes that I've described, crying, trembling, laughter, storming, tantruming, and yawning, are all really uncomfortable while they're happening, and yet pleasurable at the same time. We don't really want it to happen. Next characteristic, 6th characteristic of the discharge mechanisms, they're interwoven. Someone's crying hard for a long time, they're going to suddenly find themselves laughing. A few minutes later, they may be yawning, and then they're back to crying again. If you laugh for a long enough time, you may end up finding that you get a case of the shakes. And people will very often cycle in and out of these if they're in a place of really deep, deep discharge. Unfortunately, that tends to get defined as instability. Like, oh, this person's really losing it, they're really emotionally unstable, they may have serious mental health problems. It's like, no, this is actually how these were designed to function. Again, it's their natural functioning. Is that crying and laughter and trembling, we're going to just tend to have these things come on us in waves once we're in that deep releasing kind of place. And a deep releasing kind of place is not, as I was saying, because we're feeling so bad. It's because we're actually in a place where on some deep level, things in our lives are improving a little bit, or at least that day they're improving a little bit. And so it's not just that we're feeling all this stuff, but suddenly we're feeling it in a way that allows it to actually move through us and get out. When we're in that kind of place, it's not going to be at all uncommon. Someone's crying one minute, then laughing, then back to crying, then back to laughing, and so forth. That's not a sign of instability. That's totally, totally normal. And then oddly enough, suddenly yawning. And then the seventh characteristic of these discharge processes is that they are profoundly healing. They work. They lead to really significantly increased mental clarity, like the fog goes out of our heads. We start to feel like we're smart. We start to feel like we can find solutions to problems that earlier just didn't seem to have any solution. They give us increased energy. We get out of a sense of lethargy. We get over a place of just feeling unmotivated. Suddenly we feel like doing things. Suddenly we feel like being alive. We have this kind of like engagement with life, kind of, vim and verve, as they used to say, like a desire. Like life becomes really interesting, and we decide we want to engage with it. And we become more open, more loving, more desiring of close human connection, and more able to have close human connection, more able to feel safe enough to do that. So let me add just a couple quick comments about these forms of discharge. The reason we call them discharge in co-counseling is just to distinguish them from other kinds of experiences that people may find a wonderful release, like really intense exercise. Some people just say, oh, that's such a release. Or burping or sighing, or some people find sex like this great release. A lot of people find sex very releasing. That's release in a different sense. It will get tension to dissipate, which is really good for us, and that's a great thing. But it won't actually remove old injuries from us. And whereas these specific discharge processes will actually get rid of a chunk of an old injury and it's gone. And I don't mean that we're done processing that injury. Like a really heavy trauma or a huge loss in life, you may have to cry about or rage about or whatever has to come out about it for hundreds of hours. I'm just saying the particular piece that you dumped out that day, that piece will not be back. And this process you see lots of progress over time. The other thing I want to say about the specific processes is that trembling is probably the one that's the most thoroughly repressed. There's societal repression of all of these, but that's probably the one that's the most completely clamped down on. Really getting a case of the shakes is considered somehow like, oh, it means something bad is going to happen to your body, like this is somehow doing you harm. It's not. It's actually doing you good. People will almost immediately give you alcohol or do something to try to get you to stop shaking, or they think you're cold and they're going to bury you in blankets. And they're going to tell you, calm yourself, settle down. So the trembling that we need to do from fear is probably the most cut off form of discharge, and we really need it. We really need to bring it back to life. And by the way, it's been observed in animals, you can read about it in some of the trauma literature, that animals will also tremble after they've had a bad scare. The example being animals that have been chased by a predator and then have survived it, have gotten away, will tremble for a while. And as with human beings, when it gets a chance to work in human beings, it works. Like the animal then seems to be done with it and just goes back to normal living, doesn't seem to have any lasting effects from the scare that they've gotten, because they got to tremble it out the way they needed to. So these are the single most powerful paths to human healing. This is really how we were meant to heal from trauma. And we should continue to use every other healing avenue that we have. I always tell people, whatever you have found that works, stay with it. If psychotherapy helps you, if support groups help you, if yoga and meditation help you, and spirituality help you, if some of the body-oriented, more body-oriented therapies that are out there now help you, whatever you find works, do it. We're not asking anybody to give up anything that they have found healing. What we're saying is the discharge processes will tend to work much more deeply and much faster than anything else. And in some ways, they're what all these other processes lead to. All these other techniques that we use for healing help bring us to a place where really deep discharge becomes possible. But then the deep discharge never happens because almost nobody seems to know about this, even though it's so natural to us. It's an odd thing that something that's so natural and inherent to us that we're born with and start doing right away could somehow disappear from human awareness. But certainly in our times, and at least for a few thousand years, the understandings about these processes have disappeared. And so this is why healing from trauma is such a difficult process and such a slow-moving process, is that is that what we most need to have happen is missing from people's knowledge. So I'm saying keep in all these other things we're using for healing from trauma, but then add in these 5 discharge processes, and suddenly you'll start to see a complete change. You'll start to see everything working so much faster, so much more successfully. And rather than just feeling like, ooh, I'm managing to get a little step more out of things, or things are moving a little bit, with deep discharge, you start to feel like, whoa, this is a whole new life. Like this is like I'm actually healing. Like this is a completely different way of living. And then the last thing I'll say about the discharge process is, you may have noticed back when I was describing what the 5 processes are, that I kept using the term deep and prolonged laughter, deep and prolonged storming, right? Deep and prolonged crying and so forth. We don't get a chance to really see what these discharge processes can do until they get to function at depth and for a long time. Even yawning can be much deeper than certain yawns can be much deeper than other yawns, and they can be prolonged. You can do deep yawns for 20 or 30 minutes. You'll feel noticeably better. Your mood will improve, your energy will improve, and your mental clarity will improve. And so these processes all work. So in the next lesson, we'll say a little bit more about how we create a context for these discharge processes to happen, because that's so much what we do in co-counseling, is try to help get these channels back open and help people understand how do you set conditions up on a particular day and to help our healing processes have a chance of actually going forward that day.